Well, let's just open in prayer. That's a good way to start. Father, as always, we thank you for your word. We thank you for so many things that you've given to us, and we learn about them there. And we just pray that as we look into some of the background behind one of these letters that your Apostle Paul wrote, that you'll help it be beneficial to us, give us a little better understanding of what was going on, and maybe see some areas of application we haven't thought of before. And just pray too for Marty and Al as they begin going through Colossians on Sunday mornings. And it's a great book and a great body of truth that we should be very practical for us in our world today. Just commit our time to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so the background, Paul's letter to Colossians. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, okay. So we start with geography. We're going to learn a little bit about the Lycus River Valley and the city of Colossae. Colossians is right there. So it's right in the southwestern corner, in a sense, quadrant of Asia Minor, also known as Turkey today, also known as the Anatolian Peninsula, also known as Anatolia. I find when I go through my notes, I use those almost interchangeably, so sometimes I'll do one and sometimes the other, but that's what the area, that's where the geography is of it. Specifically, the Lycus River is a tributary of the Meander River. Now, as you might guess, the Meander River is actually where we get our word meander. It's got lots and lots and lots of curves in it. And so it extends, as you can see, between Colossae, Laodicea, and Ephesus, it's about 100 miles. So you got this long river valley that goes all the way from the interior here in the Lycus Valley, where the confluence is, all the way out to the ocean just south of Ephesus. So it's a pretty critical place, a pretty critical piece of the geography of Asia Minor. The Lycus Valley had a mixed population from the beginning of Phrygians. That was the native population, because there's an area there called Phrygia. Greeks who colonized there all over this part of the world, and Jews, interestingly enough. We'll talk about them here in a little bit. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, in 213, the Seleucid Emperor Antiochus III forcibly transported 2,000 Jewish families from Babylon and Mesopotamia to Phrygia and Lydia, this area of Asia Minor. And so pretty early on, you had a substantial Jewish population that was there, not just those who may have migrated, that we refer to as the diaspora, in the sense that just groups that went to various parts of the Mediterranean world. And it was such a core foundation there that by the first century, the Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher from Alexandria, could comment that there are Jews in every city in Asia Minor. So that's one of the, I think, unique feature of kind of what we're talking about with this area and this group of people and things. Both the Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon, you guys have read all them, right? Anyway, we owe to them most of our knowledge of the Persian Empire and the Greek development of the Greek civilization. They both documented the Greco-Persian Wars, which were pretty important. They're important even to the Old Testament story of Esther, for example, who gets involved with some of the characters of that. But during the first of those wars, the Persian Emperor Xerxes, in 480 BC, both of them record him stopping in Colossae. Now, at that time, Colossae was the largest city in the Lycus Valley. and it was a major thoroughfare. It was at the intersection of the broadly north and south trade route and the east and west trade route. And of course, with the access down the Meander Valley to Ephesus, that was a pretty critical place to get things onto the ships and stuff, but it was an important city at that time. In addition to this very wide fertile valley that had lots of crops, mostly figs and olives, they also found it a really, really good place for grazing for sheep. And as a result of that, developed a very sophisticated wool industry, textile industry. This wool was very high quality, and then what they did is, they dyed it with a special dye that was kind of a red purple or purple color, and it was very, very sought after in the first century world. When you look at pictures or see things about Romans, particularly the nobility, those red stripes they often have on the edges of their garments were made from this wool. So it was very much in demand, particularly in the more elite families, the more well-to-do. So it was a very profitable trade. The wool was referred to as Colossae wool. And that was a term that we get from the Latin historian Pliny the Elder, who the word Colossae is the word for this flower. That is the Latin word that is very common in southwestern Asia Minor. And this wool was dyed very much the same color. And so the city of Colossae eventually got its name from the development and the production of this Colossae wool from the textile industry. Another interesting little kind of side note in this is when we just got finished with Philippians, first went to Philippi and began preaching. It says one who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, who's just north of here, in Asia Minor, a seller of purple goods. And so she was in the same business. A seller of purple goods that highlighted is one Greek word, only occurs in Acts in the New Testament in the story of the church at Philippi. But it indicates that she either sold the finished product or sold the dye, one of the two. So that's where she was making her living from that. So the trade route, unfortunately, shifted. About the 3rd century BC, that north-south route shifted past to one side of Colossae and went to Laodicea. And remember, Laodicea, the map we looked at earlier, was north and a little bit west of Colossae, and was in direct line on the Meander down to the area of Ephesus. So it got bypassed during that time, and began to kind of change the future of what was the richest, most largest city in the area at the time that Xerxes was there. The Lycus Valley, the whole area, became eventually part of what was known as the Kingdom of Pergamum during the 2nd century. And the last king of that kingdom bequeathed his entire kingdom to Rome. And he did that in 133 BC. And so the Romans moved in. They reorganized the area into a senatorial province of Asia. And that's where, the word Asia often attached to this is from that Roman usage of it. Colossae declined in importance during the Roman era. So by the time you get to the time of the Apostle Paul, it was primarily a rural community. There was still a city there, but it was much smaller than its neighbors to the north, both Laodicea and Hierapolis. Both are mentioned in the New Testament. And so it kind of took a back seat to them. The Roman historian Tacitus records that there was a major earthquake in the Lycus Valley sometime in the 60s AD that did a lot of damage to both Laodicea and Hierapolis. He doesn't mention anything about Colossae, but there's a good chance that it was probably damaged as well. And so we don't know, because the site for Colossae has never been excavated. It's one of the few places like that. Just hasn't. There was a couple of attempts here in the recent decade that haven't really come to fruition yet in terms of getting cooperation from the Turkish government and everybody, so we just really don't know much about it. So most of the archaeological evidence that we have that has to do with Colossae is from Laodicea or from Hierapolis, which have been excavated. But we do have coinage from Colossae well into the 3rd century. So if it was damaged, it wasn't damaged beyond repair, because it continued putting out coins, minting coins. Most cities minted their own coins. And where that numismatic or coin evidence becomes valuable for us is understanding the religious atmosphere, because these coins honored various deities that were worshipped by the people in the community. That's the reason they put them on there. We think of, for example, even Roman coinage, we think of the Caesar's image being on, the coin that Jesus talked about. But the reason that Caesar was there in that image is as much because he had a place as a deity in the Roman scheme of things. And on the reverse side, usually they had some other Roman god, some other character like that. It wasn't because of a political thing like we have pictures of Washington or Jefferson or whatever on our money. This religious atmosphere, the things we see there were Artemis. We talked about Artemis a lot when we talked about Ephesians and the introduction to Ephesians. The Roman term I got in parentheses here for these same gods. Artemis is the Greek, Roman is Diana, the goddess of the hunt, wild animals, chastity, and childbirth. And probably the most popular or widely worshipped deity, goddess in the Asia Minor generally. We know this from Acts, where the silversmiths got up in arms because the gospel was spreading so well that it hit the economy. Their little shrines or little silver things they made of Artemis weren't selling. And so the silversmiths actually rioted against Paul and the people in the church during that time. We have that recorded. There's also other Greco-Roman gods that were worshipped throughout Asia Minor and through the Lycus Valley. Zeus, which is the chief Greek Roman god, a Greek god, and Jupiter, the counterpart in the Roman pantheon, were both always in there some way or another. The other ones that we find are Athena, or Minerva, the goddess of reason, handicraft, wisdom, and war, in both sides of that. And the goddess Demeter, or Ceres. Demeter is the Greek, and Ceres is the Roman goddess of agriculture and harvest. So those are the ones we find on these coins. We also find the imported cults of Isis and Serapis from Egypt. They were common throughout the Mediterranean. I think when we were talking about Ephesus, we spoke about them a little bit as well. But unique to the Lycus Valley were some native Phrygian deities. One of them is Main, which is a lunar god with some Persian roots, actually, to it. And the other one was Agdatis, or Cybele. That's the Phrygian and the Greek term, side by side, who was probably the most popular goddess in Anatolia, in this part of Anatolia. The followers were known for their frenzied singing, dancing, and even self-mutilation during worship. So, she was an exciting goddess anyway, apparently. Of course, throughout this area, just like we have in all the rest of the first century Mediterranean world, you have local and household spirits or gods that were honored, and a tremendous amount of interest in magic and astrology, both. There's a record of the temple tax collected in Laodicea in about 60 BC. And it numbered the Jewish males in the Lycus Valley at that time at about 10,000. So it's easy, we can say then that all of the cities in the Lycus Valley would have had also a significant Jewish population in each one of them. So these are the influences you have kind of coming into the Lycus Valley. Now, this is no different really than the influences we looked at to some extent in Ephesus, to some extent in Philippi. And so, what makes it more interesting here is that there's something about this combination, this soup of stuff going on in the Lycus Valley that prompted Paul to write this letter. And part of what you see going on here that I think was a real concern to him was syncretism. Now, syncretism, I got a nice definition here for you. A blending of different, often contradictory religious and or philosophical beliefs or practices to form a new belief or practice in such a way that, at least on the surface, the contradictions between them are resolved. So that means that you can hold completely opposite positions but make some sort of syncretistic effort and you bring them together. Now, that opens up all kinds of possibilities and permutations and commutations of things that were going on. And apparently this was pretty common in the Lycus Valley. There's an interesting find at Hierapolis, a funerary inscription that was uncovered originally that had the inscription on it was for encouraging the people who still left, the person who died, encouraging the people who were still around to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, well, so this is often used as evidence. Okay, well, here's part of this Jewish influence. We got some actual physical artifacts that we can deal with there. Well, recently, the excavations have actually uncovered the rest of that inscription. And so it encourages his progeny to include, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Pentecost, and the Feast of Calends. Okay, if you're going to like that, don't look for that in your Old Testament. It's not there. Calends is the pagan feast celebrating the first day of the month of the Roman lunar calendar. So this syncretism, the Jews were not exempt from this, because you got this just built right into this piece of evidence. So, what was the purpose and provenance of Paul's letter? So provenance being, when it was written, who was involved with it, and things like that, and what was the purpose of it? Well, the purpose, I think, goes back to this soup of religious beliefs in the Lycus Valley. Paul saw some challenges to that, to the new Christians, that maybe weren't occurring in other places. Because probably of the tendency of them to say, well, I like this new Christian stuff. I can just rope this in with my existing whatever. And apparently that's part of what was going on. And I think that's why Colossians, because we're going to look at some parallels between Colossians and Ephesians a little bit. And why was the Ephesians written? Because it covers a lot of the same ground, and Colossians both, what was going on there. So we're going to look at this, what we know about the letter here. First of all, we know that Paul had never visited Colossae. So whatever he knew about them, he got from other sources. This is, right there he talks about, who have not seen me face to face. We know that one of his co-workers, Epaphras, evangelized the Lycus Valley. We see this in the beginning of Colossians, that you learn from them, our faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. And probably this all took place, the church was founded in Colossae, and probably in Laodicea and Hierapolis as well, during Paul's extended stay in Ephesus. We know he is there 2 to 3 years. And we know that, as Acts records, that all the Asia heard the word of the Lord, heard about Jesus. It was evidenced by the silversmiths in Ephesus. So pretty wide evangelization going on there. So the events of Acts 19, where Paul, all this kind of happened, were about 4 to 5 years before Paul's imprisonment. Now, we've been studying Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, are referred to as the prison epistles. And they all kind of share then some common ground that's important. First of all, they all talk about Paul being in prison. And I've got the references up there. But they also have this overlap of this group of New Testament characters that occur in them, that are part of what's going on, carrying the letter, ministering, bringing the gospel, going back to deliver a message. That all these people were involved in all these letters in probably a fairly compressed period of time. Just a little note that some New Testament scholars believe Epaphroditus and Epaphras were the same people, much like Silas and Silvanus in the New Testament are the same person. The evidence for this one is not quite as strong as that one, but if it's true, then you see even a tighter connection, particularly with Philippians, of all these things, all these letters. Now, while we know for sure who was involved in all these things with the letter, we do have some questions about where Paul was imprisoned. And I want to talk a little bit about this, not a lot, but there's a question that's been raised. Even conservative scholars, really liberal scholars don't even think Paul wrote these letters. But the conservative scholars who accept that Pauline authorship, or at least an amanuensis wrote it for him, pretty much are down to, okay, they mostly are their traditional Roman imprisonment, but there are a few that are arguing, particularly recently, for Ephesus. And so I wanted to say a couple things about that. There's really three things that lead to this. And I'm going to hit all of them here in a minute, but before I get to this first one, there is no record in Acts of Paul being in prison in Ephesus. But he wrote 2 Corinthians not long after he was in Ephesus, and he talks in 2 Corinthians about multiple imprisonments. And so there's some, we don't know where all those were. So the idea that, just because it says he was or he wasn't, that's kind of an argument from silence. So that really isn't the important one. There are three other things that contribute to people thinking maybe it was Ephesus. And I'm going to deal with each one of those pretty quickly here. First of all was Paul's plan to visit Colossae after his release. In Philippians, in Philemon 22, he asked Philemon to prepare a guest room for him, anticipating his release. Well, we know from Romans that Paul's plan, his preferred plan, was to go on from Rome to Spain. And so the argument here is that, well, if he was already in Rome and he wanted to go to Spain, why would he go all the way back to Colossae and then go all the way back to Rome and then on to Spain? Because he was talking about Rome being his springboard. We don't know whether he ever made that trip for sure, but at least he was talking about it. So, he'd be going in the opposite direction. The second one has to do with the we sections of Acts. So if you've ever read through Acts, you know that part of it, Luke is going along, and they did this, and he did this, and they did this, and they did this, and then all of a sudden, and we were here, and we went there, and then it goes back to they, and then it goes back to we. So there's a couple sections of Acts where Luke was obviously present when these things were going on. So we know that in Colossians 4:10 and 4:14 and Philemon 4:24, both Luke and Mark send their greetings. They're with Paul at this point. The problem with that is that why then, if it's in Ephesus in Acts 19, are those not we sections? It seems to be that Luke isn't there, So that Luke wasn't anywhere if he wasn't in Ephesus when Paul was in prison in Ephesus. So we don't have any of those. We do have a we section for Philippians, for the founding of the church in Philippi. but we don't have it there. The other part is that Mark, there's no indication when it talks about the third missionary journey that he went. So that's kind of an argument that says, well, okay, shouldn't we see those things if he was in Ephesus? You know, if he was imprisoned in Ephesus? The third one has to do with geography and travel. The argument hinges on the assumption that Onesimus, who was the slave that ran away, that's talked about in Philemon, and he's mentioned in Colossians as well, that he's more likely to go 120 miles to Ephesus than he is to go 1,500 miles to Rome to get away. That seems like a long way to go. And then when you read this little dialogue and messages between Colossians and Philemon that go on between Paul and Onesimus and Philemon, yeah, I'm going to need something to drink. Excuse me. You see that, you know, Onesimus has gone to Colossae and now being asked to go right back to Rome. I mean, all the way, 1,500 miles. And so that's, thank you, one of the arguments that, you know, that makes a lot more sense about this. In kind of a counter to that, we need to look at a couple things. One is, how long were these journeys really going to take? And they covered a lot of long distances that we wouldn't even, you know, are just crazy for us to think about when you consider they did it on foot or on sailing ship. But the journey between Rome and Colossae took about 18 days if you went by sea. And it's this red line right here. You go through the, you know, Corinthian, that isthmus in there, and then you get out and cross into Ephesus, and then you get on the road. But it's mostly a sea voyage, so those were faster than on foot. And so about 18 days is how long it took. And the argument for people who don't think that Ephesus is that important for that is that for the distances is because that's not that long in their time. That seems like a long time for us, but they did traveling like that all the time. Went those long distances and took those long times. To walk from Rome to Philippi on the Appia Way took longer. Took about 30 days to get there. So that's what travel was. You know, they couldn't. You know, most of them didn't have the advantage of horse-drawn even. I mean, most of the history we know, more recent history, last 500 years before the automobile and things like that, you know, the horse, you know, at least you could have maybe, you know, a decent speed going with that. But the rest of the world prior to that was all 3 miles an hour. That was it. So that's what I think so I don't think that's a huge argument. It's not a huge argument against that. The other kind of parts to that I think are important or maybe to keep in mind is that maybe Onesimus really wanted to get away from the area. With all the commerce between Colossae and Ephesus, is he more likely to run into somebody that knows his master in Ephesus or in the largest city in the Roman Empire? And so there's some good argument that he would have gone there. He ended up running into Paul, which is really a pretty interesting story for that man. And it's also unlikely that Paul would have written a letter, because we're going to see in a minute that Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon were all carried at one time probably by Tychicus. So they all were sent out at once. Well, why would Paul write a letter to the Ephesians if he was in Ephesus? So that's another kind of question here. So they kind of cancel each other out, these various arguments. You can go both ways with these things. But I think that we can probably safely stick with the traditional viewpoint that the imprisonment was in Rome, and that's where Paul was writing from. So, as I mentioned, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon were all carried by Tychicus. We have that recorded in these letters. And we also know that he was accompanied by Onesimus, this runaway slave, who was going back and delivering this handwritten letter from Paul to his former master, Philemon. So the other thing that's kind of interesting about this relationship between Ephesus and Colossians, is the idea of circular letters. If you get into the manuscript evidence for the text of Ephesians, what you find that's kind of interesting is most of the oldest manuscripts do not have the words in Ephesus in them. Some of the oldest and best ones don't have in Ephesus. A lot of the later ones do. So, what was going on with that? You know, why is that missing from those older manuscripts? And the most of the, I think, scholarship on this, the guys who really get into this textual criticism stuff, like, you know, Wallace and people like that, they argue that this, what appears to be a textual problem, can actually be resolved by thinking in terms of the fact that this was a circular letter. Paul intended this to go to more than one place. And so the original copies that were written basically just had a blank. Fill in your city. And so Tychicus, who's carrying these letters, would go to these various places, and he would have this copy he'd give to the church. They could write in the name of their church, and then then they would copy that for the various house churches and churches in the area. And that happened with what he was. That's one of the reasons for this. Which is why it shows up in so many copies then, because Ephesus was the biggest church in Asia Minor. The kind of the other part of this is kind of interesting is that Tychicus, when you look at his travel, think back to the map, if he was going from Rome, okay, he went again down around between Italy and Sicily, along the Corinthian Isthmus, out across the Aegean, and into Ephesus. That was the main port for going into Asia Minor. First letter. Okay? So, what's the next place he's going to hit? So he's on his way to Colossae. You remember that map? You go down the Meander Valley, Laodicea. And so the next place he's going to hit is probably going to be, here's your letter, Laodicea. And they get to fill their little name in here and have it. So when you get to Colossians then, you got an instruction when he delivers Colossians finally to that city, where they say, oh, and by the way, you need to share this letter with Laodicea, and you need the one that was written to them, which we don't have. Well, we didn't think we have. But there's a good chance that it's Ephesians, what we know as Ephesians. Now, there's a couple other things that kind of, some evidence for that as well. If you remember going through Ephesians here, which we just finished, not too long ago, Philippians has been in between, so we might forget a few things. But if you go back and read through Ephesians, you find that there's an absence of personal names. The only person that's mentioned is Tychicus, who carried the letter. Now you think about that in terms of Philippians or in terms of Colossians, and there's several names in there. I mean, you get to Romans, you got almost a whole chapter of names of people in there. But there aren't these personal names. The second thing is the recipients in Ephesians 1:15 are described. He says, for this reason, because I have heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love toward all the saints. Paul spent almost 3 years in Ephesus and he's only heard of their faith. He wouldn't write that to Ephesus, to the Ephesians. I mean, he knew those people personally. He was there for quite a long time, one of the longer stays that he had. So that's another kind of thing. We already see the connection between Ephesians and Colossians, both carried by Tychicus. And as I mentioned, as he goes to this path, you got Ephesus, Laodicea, and then he goes on down the Lycus Valley to Colossae. So that brings up then some interesting things about the parallels between the letters of Colossians and Ephesians. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of common kind of concepts and terminology that's used. Some of the most obvious terminologies, you look at them, is you look at the beginning, or these two places, not the beginning of one of them, really in kind of halfway through the other one, where Paul talks about his own God's commission that was given to me for you. And you can see the same wording, same words being used. And all of these things are more striking in the Greek text, the similarity between them. We see this, from whom the whole body is held together for growth. Same kind of ideas. And finally, psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. These rare terms in the New Testament, but we find them paralleled almost exactly in these two letters. They just match up. Generally, Ephesians appears to be an expansion of Colossians. So the order was probably, contrary to our New Testaments, Colossians was written first. And Paul had a particular purpose for that, as I mentioned. You know, there's some unique things to Colossians, and I think there were some unique things to the Lycus Valley and the challenges there that he wanted to address. So he wrote this letter. But, you know, with travel the way it is, you know, even though they did it all without thinking that much about it, it was still enough he didn't do it just on a whim. And so he's going to wait till he kind of had things lined up for this. And the thinking is that Paul then decided, you know what, I'm going to write a letter to the other churches in Asia Minor, where I ministered and my people with me for 3 years almost, and all the churches that are there. But I have some good ideas here in Colossians, and I'm going to build on those. Okay? So you see this, I think one of the really great examples of this is this section right here. If you took it Colossians 1:17 through 22, it's all one paragraph, all right? But when you look at Ephesians, you see that the first 3 verses of that, 17, 18, and 19, parallel Ephesians 1:22 and 23, which in that chapter, and start chapter 2 in Ephesians, which is all about the new life in Christ and reconciliation of the Gentiles and all those kinds of things. And then you come back in 2:13, but now Jesus, who once was far off, you've been brought near, paralleling that through him to reconcile himself. Anyway, you see the parallel ideas being stated and then expanded upon. And you see the same thing in the social statements that are made. Again, in Colossians you have this just 2 verses about the relationship between husband and wives. Ephesians expands on that. You have a few verses about children and their parents, and Ephesians expands upon that. And it's not quite as much of an expanse, but you have the same thing in the bondservants and masters. So probably there's similarities between the two are because Colossians was the foundational idea. I mean, that was they wrote that first, and they wanted to include special things in it, but they took the really important ideas and fleshed them out in Ephesians in a way that was going to be relevant to multiple churches.
Seems to be contradicting circular theory, though. If there's so many parallels, why would you have to read a parallel version of the Laodicean?
Why would you have to have Ephesians if you already had Colossians?
Yeah.
I really think it's because there were some things unique in the Lycus Valley that Paul wanted to address, that when he first wrote that, because I believe that was the first one he wrote, he didn't think were so necessary in those other places. But there were things that he wanted to expand upon that he felt was important for those other places.
Doesn't it also point more to the fact that he probably wrote all of these letters?
Yes, it does. Yeah, even though clearly the style and the quality of Greek, he used a secretary or amanuensis to write these things, I think, again, you see the same thing from them, you know, that they're from the same brain. Anyway. So that kind of brings us, I think, then back to what's so unique about Colossians. What was it that Paul was trying to get at there? And so we'll kind of wrap up here with the emphasis of Colossians. Particularly, I think, when you look at Colossians, though, what's really unique about that is chapter 2 and the warnings that are there. We have a question that you have to kind of talk about. Watch out for whom? Who's Paul saying to watch out for? Which I stole as a title of Adam Copenhaver's thesis anyway. Watch out for whom? And so, who was Paul warning against? And the whole this whole section then of verses 6 through 23 of chapter 2 of Colossians deal with these issues, deal with these things that were a particular concern. And Douglas Moo, the New Testament commentator, scholar, has identified 11 different characteristics of this false teaching in verses 6 through 23. And you could just about take any one of them and make a sermon out of it. But he's identified 11 different characteristics that generally scholars, New Testament scholars, agree on as being that characteristics of these false teachers and false teaching. It's how you put them together, or what you try to make out of those, where you get all the disagreements and debate. So I want to look at that common ground quickly. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them, because like I said, you can spend a lot of time on any one of them probably. But these 11 distinctive characteristics that we see isolated in these verses. The first one is he warns against deceptive philosophy. Philosophy was a term that in the ancient world that meant a lot of different kinds of belief systems. It wasn't as narrow as it is in our thinking about it. But the key was that these were coherent systems of some kind. So that was what separated it out, as opposed to a bunch of random different things. He talked about an emphasis on human traditions. Now, while that is reminiscent of the words to Jesus of Jesus about the Pharisees in Mark 7, you leave the commandment of God and hold the traditions of men. That may have been in mind here, but generally it's hard to be definitive about that. Whether these traditions of men that he's talking about here were the Jewish traditions, and maybe this was one of those a Jewish aspect of the syncretic influence here, or whether it was something else. But we can't really say for sure. It's a pretty general statement. We have this idea of dependence on the spiritual forces of this world. It includes this, in this phrase, is a Greek word, stoikoion, which can mean the basic components of something. It can mean transcendental forces that control things. It's got this very broad semantic range, and so it's hard to figure out exactly what it means. It's used 7 times in the New Testament. Paul uses it twice in Galatians. He uses it twice in Colossians. It's used in Hebrews once, and Peter uses it twice in 2 Peter. And all of them are a little bit different in terms of the context of what kind of meaning you draw out of it. So even though it's used here as a description of this false teaching, we don't exactly know. We can't really nail it down. And the other part of that is we don't know whether this was a phrase that was used by the false teachers or used by Paul to describe the false teachers. So anyway, again, you can see this. These are pretty generic, a lot of them. This one, not according to Christ, which is a statement kind of that follows from those, I think is a theme for this whole section. That this is the real problem, is none of this stuff is according to Christ. And then he goes on and talks about that as he develops it. Observance of food restrictions and festivals or holy days may be a reference to either Jewish or pagan practices. Although the Jewish dietary rules were more recognizable during this time, and there were certainly a lot of Jews in the area that you could see those. Maybe a Jewish influence. Ascetic disciplines, like fasting and even perhaps self-mutilation. Remember Cybele and all of her, crazy worshipers dancing around. Worship of angels. Again, another phrase that's really debated. We don't really know what that means, and we don't really know what the relation between that is and Paul talking about powers and authorities in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Colossians. Emphasis on visions that they have had. There's some sort of ecstatic experiences that were part of these teachings. There's hubristic spirituality, spiritual pride in their accomplishments and their visions and their experiences and all these different things. Paul complains of a lost connection to the head of the body. Now, I think that that has a lot to do with one of two things. These groups were either isolating themselves from the church, so they weren't coming into the body, they weren't spending time with other believers, but they were claiming to be Christians. Or they were in these groups and just forming little cells of kind of contrary stuff going on. In other words, they're a classic case that of something that I think is true, that there is no Christian life without the church. And yet people would try to do that. I mean, people in our society try to do that. People say, well, yeah, I don't really like church, a bunch of hypocrites. I'd rather go out in the hill and commune with God, just the two of us. But yeah, I'm a Christian. I don't think you can say that. But I think that's part of what this was describing here, is people who were just disconnecting themselves from the body of Christ, from the church. And finally, they had very complex rules for spiritual growth. This is how you grow spiritually. Now, some of these things should sound pretty contemporary. Where do you want, spiritual insights? Man, we got a society that's into all kinds of getting into spirit stuff, and you go to these seminars and they tell you how you do all this and how you find out these things. People within the church who claim that they got the answers, step 1, 2, 3, 4. So this really kind of encompasses all those groups, both ancient and contemporary in that sense. So there's plenty of stuff here that has a very general meaning. But also there was something about the Lycus Valley that they really had an issue with this. So as challenging as it is to reconstruct, maybe what this teaching was, what the threat was, it was also difficulty is actually debate about the identity of that threat. Who was this? Were these Jews who were taking in these things? Were these pagans who were taking in these things? Was this a unique philosophy, a coherent philosophy of some kind that was really popular and growing and challenging the church? And so a lot of the debates you have about Colossians, and some of them are pretty heated, have to do with people trying to figure out who this was. Were these pre-Gnostics? Were these, what were they? Secularized Jews or paganized Jews? Were they, Judaic pagans? Were they, what was really going on here? And so a lot of it, depending on how you put these things together then, you can argue for, well, I think it was this, so you pick out those characteristics that fit, and you kind of ignore the ones that don't, and lots of that kind of thing going on. So we kind of come down to the choice then about, really there's two options. The first one is some sort of unique syncretism of Jewish and pagan beliefs, because that list includes too many of both not to be a syncretistic belief system of some kind. If it's one system, it's got to be one like this. But I think more New Testament commentators and scholars are kind of coming around to this as well, that it's more likely it's a general warning with examples. It's more of a general warning with examples, so it covers any of these little kind of offshoots and group and challenges that were going on. Just to give credit where it's due, this is what Adam argues for in his thesis, and he's actually got a book out now on looking at the more rhetorical structure of Colossians. It is much more rhetorically structured than Ephesians is, and how these things kind of fit into looking at that from this general standpoint. And so I'm going to kind of borrow from him sort of a busy, this isn't his slide, this is my slide, so if it's messy, it's me, it's not him. This is that whole section, okay? Now, that's pretty dense.
It's messy.
Huh? Anyway, so the red with the black bold are the imperatives, okay? The green are the pagan elements, and the blue are the more Jewish elements, potentially. And so, as you read through this, you can see how as he gets each main point on this thing, he has examples of both as he's going through here. He says, so it could come from here, it could come from here, and then he gets into another, therefore let no one pass judgment on you or disqualify you, and you got, references to both of them again. And you can see the pattern of this as he kind of comes down through the final piece of it, which I think is probably pretty important, and that's the last verse or so, 23 and 20. Yeah, 23. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and a severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping indulgence of the flesh. And from there, you go into chapter 3 of Colossians, where Paul does the same thing that we saw him doing in Ephesians, where the first 2 chapters are orthodoxy, and the last 2 chapters are orthopraxy. But he's built this up, taking these first 2 chapters. Chapter 1, really, you could probably summarize that, the superiority of Jesus. Chapter 2, here's all the stuff that's going to try to lead you astray. All right? That's the orthopraxy. Orthodoxy. Now, orthopraxy. How do we deal with this? How do you live your life as a Christian and deal with these things? And, the sermonizing, leaving to these guys, so I'm going to... Really, this is what ends up then the emphasis of Colossians. And if you take that phrase, superiority and sufficiency of Christ in all things, and start reading through Colossians, you're going to find it hits every single section, both orthodoxy and orthopraxy. That's it.